One of the saddest things to see in the COVID pandemic was the amount of people who trusted what they were told, followed along with the recommendations, and as an outcome, had an injury. And those people who were injured, instead of the medical and scientific community supporting them, saying, listen, this is to some extent collateral damage, they were just left. They were ignored. They were gaslit. They were told that they were anti vax, even though they had taken a vaccine. The good news is that there is finally coming some degree of acknowledgement about what may have happened. And I'll share with you just the recent update from RFK Jr. as to what he was saying, and quickly give you an insight into what I think is the primary mechanism or one of the mechanisms around what could be happening. Let's quickly listen to what RFK said on this interview here. This is a short interview, and hear his perspective with regards to what had happened.
Let me ask you, are you going to make any investments in long COVID and vaccine injuries in terms of coming up with treatments and data to help clinicians, help their patients?
Yeah, that's going to be one of our priority focuses. We already have a division at NIH that is devoted to studying long COVID and to figuring out cures and to study, and we're incorporating an agency within CDC that is going to specialize in vaccine injuries. Oh, those are things that are priorities for me, and also Lyme disease. These are priorities for the American people. More and more people are suffering from these injuries, and we are committed to having gold standard science to make sure that we can figure out what the treatments are and that we can deliver the best treatments possible to the American people.
Let me ask you, are you going to make any investments in long?
So that's an important statement by him, because what has happened so far is that because so many people were afraid of even saying that there could be issues, this got completely ignored. And I don't think it should be forgotten that, in effect, science and medicine didn't do their advocacy for people who were injured. It didn't take a lot. It didn't mean that you had to necessarily stop the vaccine campaign, but you had to acknowledge the injuries. I think that part of the problem may have been that the injuries were so many based on a New Zealand a thesis that came up. It was almost 10 times higher than any other, say, the seasonal influenza vaccine. And so then, yes, it would have gotten the public worried, and therefore less people would have taken the vaccine. So that probably was going through their head, but it doesn't mean that that was necessarily the correct thing to do when you think about what had happened. Here is one of my quick thoughts about what happens in terms of vaccine injuries. And you have to remember that the numbers or percentages, even though the percentage is small, that could still be a significant proportion of people across the population. Some are aware, but there's an even bigger number who are completely unaware and haven't made the connection as to the fact that they may be ill because of this, and they don't quite realize that this is the reality. Let's take a look at what I think is a simplistic way of looking at the issue. It's what I call the Swiss cheese model of vaccine injury. And you would have here at the top all COVID injections. So the vast majority of people may not have any obvious injuries. But this is the bit that I think a lot of people are unaware about, what we call hypermetabolic lymphadenopathy. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. And if you have this with a situation where there is ongoing spike circulation, you can then end up with lung vaccine pathology, where somebody has long-term illness because of the vaccination. Now, you may find that at the moment I can still hopefully openly talk about this, but in reality, it's still a taboo subject. But here is the science, and the science comes from an incidental reporting or incidental research on preparing patients for cancer and trying to identify them who had cancer spreading to their lymph nodes. And how that's done is by doing a PET scan, positron emission tomography. And this is what it would look like. And in these scans, what you do is you label glucose, you inject it, and any lymph nodes or any organs that pick it up in high amounts could represent an area where there is hypermetabolism and therefore could mean cancer. So, this is what they were doing at the time. And what they found was that within about 3 months of people being vaccinated, they were unable to be able to tell the difference between cancer and a hypermetabolic lymph node response to the vaccine. And here is what we would have in a normal situation where the vaccine is given. It would drain to the lymph nodes, cause some degree of inflammation, but that should only be quite minor. And therefore, in theory, you shouldn't see it in a normal response to the vaccine. What they were finding, however, is that that was not the pattern that was occurring in relation to vaccination. We don't quite know the mechanism, but I can only presume that the lipid nanoparticles would get inside immune cells and cause them to become overactivated. The theory was that these would remain on site in the muscle and be only picked up by the muscle cells. But again, we do realize that it was circulating, so that probably wasn't exactly the case. But when it comes to the lymph node response, this is what they found from the paper, is that you had 4 different levels where you had very mild uptake, and this is what it would look like on the scan, a little dot. Moderate uptake, and the FDG is the labeled glucose. This is what it would look like on the scan. In high uptake, you would see these very bright dots. And in stage 4, or very high uptake with enlarged lymph nodes, this is what they would get. Important to note, this was not normal. But it was again one of those things that was overlooked in the pandemic. It should really have been investigated further. Because when you looked at the paper, what it demonstrated, and this is the paper here, hypermetabolic lymphadenopathy following administration of BNT162b2 mRNA COVID vaccines. This was published all the way from 2021. And what you are seeing here is that if they have had no response, it's gray. If they have had a mild grade 1 response, it's down here. Grade 2, it's a deeper yellow. Grade 3, slightly brown. And grade 4 is here. What this shows is within 4 days of the vaccine, 15% of people vaccinated had grade 4 lymphadenopathy. By the time it was greater than 25 days, that had dropped down to 2%. But if you look carefully at this, 2 plus 4, 6 plus 16, 22% still had lymphadenopathy up to 25 days after being vaccinated. Definitely not normal. And this is what I think is the mechanism for why you got these vaccine injuries in a number of people. It's a serious problem and it needed a lot of research. But the first problem would have been to acknowledge what was happening, not to ignore it, and to look carefully at the mechanisms. They were so focused on getting a strong antibody response that what may have happened, and this is just my theory, is that they gave too big a dose to too many people. 15% having grade 4 vaccine-induced metabolic hypermetabolic lymphadenopathy suggests that that was way too high. And so therefore, what may have needed to have happened if they were doing the proper research and proper follow-up is they may have needed to reduce the dose, maybe for weight, maybe for condition, so that less people would have had these responses and therefore had a lower risk for people having long-term injury. That's the reality of what we have to face. There is no way out of it now. And luckily for us, at least RFK Jr. is planning to take a serious look at it because he is not interested in protecting the industry, just getting to the science. Let's wish him luck with that. Have a great evening.